Hello, welcome to another episode of In the Trenches with Gang Green. I'm your host, Bubbs. Today is Monday, January 13th. Hopefully, everybody's having a good day so far today. This is episode 469 of the In the Trenches with Gang Green podcast. I thank you, as always, for joining me. For those tuning in on YouTube, make sure to please like and subscribe. As always, appreciate those of you tuning in on all the different audio podcast platforms where this show can be listened to as well. Another day, another pod, and today we have our first mock draft Monday of 2025. Draft just about 3 months or so away. A lot of time before the draft, but we're going to start up our mock draft Mondays today. Every Monday from now up until the 2025 NFL draft, we will have a mock draft Monday going over a variety of different themes each week, different players, trade back, trade up, all that good stuff to get you prepped and figure out what is the best direction for the New York Jets to go in when April rolls around. As always, though, before we get into our first mock draft today on the podcast, we got to start out with our podcast partners, starting with our friends over at BetUS, America's favorite online sportsbook. Click my BetUS link in the description of this video to get a 125% sign-up bonus on your first 3 deposits up to $2,000. Make sure to check them out. NFL playoffs in full swing, college football final next week, NBA, NHL, BetUS has it all. Check them out. Click my link down below to get started. Also, our friends over at SeatGeek, if you're looking to get in on any awesome tickets and looking to get out to any awesome events, check them out. If it's your first time using SeatGeek, use promo code BUBSONSPORTS for $20 off your first purchase and get yourself out to some of the best in sports and some of the best in entertainment. And as always, Huga House as well. If you want any of their awesome selection of hats, use promo code BUBS for 15% off any purchase at checkout. And then when you use that promo code, your second hat is 30% off with code BUBS. So check them out and get yourself some awesome Huga House swag. So here we go, episode 469 of the In the Trenches with Gang Green podcast. First episode here of Mock Draft Mondays in 2025. So this week, this episode here will be the Mason Graham edition of the Mock Draft Monday episode. So today we'll take a look at Mason Graham. We'll also take a look at the 7 other players that we're going to draft here. I fired up the draft simulator this morning, went through, took all 8 selections, and we've got ourselves 8 players to take a look at. So we're starting here round 1, pick 7 with, like I mentioned, Mason Graham, defensive tackle out of Michigan. He's 6'3", 320 pounds, junior, one of the top prospects in this draft. It'll be interesting to see, how the whole draft board ends up falling here for the Jets. And it'll be interesting to see how much offense, how much defense goes off the board ultimately before the Jets get to number 7. But this is a team that you go into this draft, you go into the first round, and there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of consideration for picking up a defensive lineman. And I know the new regime isn't in yet, and obviously they could have a different approach on things. But just from the outside looking in, you look at some of the biggest needs on this roster, it starts up front on that defensive line. What Joe Douglas did to that unit this past season, tearing it down to the ground, was borderline criminal. What he did to that unit, taking it from one of the best units in the NFL and absolutely destroying it. So I think this would be a really good start for the Jets. You've also got Abdul Carter, but today we'll take a look at Mason Graham. Interior defensive lineman, provides a lot of positives, a lot of high ceiling potential from a guy that showed a lot of flashes at Michigan. When you look at some of his numbers, 108 total tackles on the season. These are his career numbers. 108 total tackles, 61 solo tackles, 9 sacks, 18 tackles for loss, 17 quarterback hits, 47 hurries, 3 passes defended, 1 forced fumble, and a fumble recovery. When you look at his numbers this past season in his final year at Michigan, 46 total tackles, which was a career high. It also led all Michigan defensive linemen. He had 24 solo tackles, which also was a career high, and also led all Michigan defensive linemen. 3.5 sacks, which was a career high. 9 quarterback hits, a career high. 20 hurries, a career high. 7 tackles for loss, and a pass defended at the line of scrimmage. So Mason Graham, you just look at some of the statistics there. A guy that's coming off of a very, very productive 2023 campaign that saw him put up some impressive career highs in some of the key statistical categories. This is also a guy, of course, that played a big role in Michigan's national championship run last year under Jim Harbaugh. You look at some of the other 2024 numbers. 90.9 PFF grade. His highest graded game came against Washington, where he produced a 90.6 PFF grade. His pass rush grade this season was an 80.5. His run defense grade this season was 92.4. And he has a 13.5% pass rush win rate. All of those rank near the top of college football when you take a look at the rest of the defensive linemen that make the cut for their percentile rankings. So this guy, when you look at both grade, some of the statistics, some of the advanced metrics, you watch him play, percentile rankings tell you he's among some of the best defensive linemen in the NFL or in college entering the NFL draft. And I think just to why I think Mason Graham would be such a solid fit here at number 7. You could go the Abdul Carter route, which I would certainly be on board with. But one of the biggest issues with the Jets defensive line this year came in the interior. The edge actually wasn't terrible. Jermaine Johnson, unfortunately, tore his Achilles, but you had Will McDonald at a career year. You're going to get Jermaine Johnson back. Those two guys playing opposite of each other next year, that can be your starting foundation in 2025 moving forward. You have Will McDonald going into year 3 and Jermaine Johnson going into year 4. So 2 guys that are young, that are still up and coming, right? You look at the interior, though, it's completely different. And that's where Mason Graham could perfectly fit in to that role of it's Quinnen Williams right now and Javon Kinlaw and Leonard Taylor and Solomon Thomas. Guys just that don't produce enough. You put a Mason Graham next to a Quinnen Williams, boom, you could have your fix there for the next 5 to 7 years. And I think that's where just the position, interior, this pick, first round, his profile matches up pretty well. He played 548 defensive snaps in 2024. 338 came against the pass, 210 against the run, and 406 out of his 548 came lined up in the B gap. So just some strengths of Mason Graham: athleticism. You watch him on tape, you watch him in games, you look at some of the numbers. Athleticism, his speed, I think is impressive for his size at 6'3", 320. He is probably one of the more athletic guys in this draft from his size perspective for an interior defensive line. Has got pretty good speed. And on top of the athleticism, something else that pops off the charts for Mason Graham is his quick get off. This is a guy that can easily beat interior offensive linemen right off the snap. And that's something that I think could separate him, kind of already does separate him among some of these other prospects, is his ability at his size in the interior to have a quick get-off speed, which translates very well to the NFL game. He also is very good at eating up double teams, which I think could potentially be positive for the Jets because Quinnen Williams is a guy that eats up a ton of double teams. So if it gets to the point where you've got to double either Quinnen or Mason Graham, you can trust him to be able to go through those and potentially opening up Quinnen or vice versa. So I think that match there matches up well, potentially alongside him. Some of the weaknesses, technique at times. He also does lack his height and arm size. He, height a little bit smaller. His arms are a little bit smaller than your prototypical interior defensive lineman. So that could be something to take a look at the next level. But overall, I think Mason Graham's a guy that, no surprise here, is a name that outweighs a lot of the positives, outweigh the potential weaknesses of his game. One of the more complete defensive players in this draft. And if he's there at 7, you definitely have to take a look at potentially putting in that pick. So that's round 1. Moving on here to round 2, pick 38. We're going to go offensive tackle here. We're going to go right tackle out of LSU, Emory Jones Jr. Now, a lot of people look at Will Campbell out of LSU and say, draft him in the first round, which is certainly a possibility. I could see that being a trade back scenario where if the Jets don't love their options at 10, let's say a McMillan's off the board, and Abdul Carter's off the board, a Mason Graham's off the board, and the other top guys are all off the board. If you don't want to reach, you could trade back and then get a Will Campbell maybe at 10, get him at 15, somewhere around there, similar to what you did last year, trading back one spot for Olu. But Emory Jones is the guy that if you don't take Will Campbell in the first round, left tackle, who could potentially play right and develop maybe into a right side guy. You take a guy that's already played right guard and has played on the other side of Will Campbell on that LFC offensive line. That's Emory Jones. 6'6", 315 pounds, junior. When you look at this guy, he is a full-on right tackle. And I think when you look at the Jets right now, in a perfect world, in my opinion, and we'll see what happens with the new regime, but in my opinion, if you're the Jets, you go out and re-sign Morgan Moses and have him play at right tackle next year on a one-year contract, and you have the full continuity, full starting lineup that you had towards the end of this year with Olu, Simpson, Tittman, AVT, Moses, and then you draft a guy like Emory Jones that has some good intangibles, I guess, I guess is the word you can use here, has some good things to his game or some pieces to his game, but needs some work, needs some seasoning, and could use some of the learning that he could get under a Morgan Moses, which is why I like this pick here for this value round 2 pick 38, day 2 pick that could sit behind Moses and potentially learn for a year and then slot in as the right tackle in 2026 and beyond. I don't necessarily think the Jets this year have to go after a right tackle in the first round or somebody that could play right tackle in the first round because Morgan Moses was good enough last year. He was above average. He was solid. I know he dealt with injuries, but he still played 13 games. And I think you got to like the idea of having continuity, already having chemistry all across all 5 on the offensive line. You look at Emory Jones's snaps, 864 total this year, 309 run, 555 against the pass. 859 of his 864 snaps this year came at right tackle. On top of that, just to show you his true ability to play right tackle and really nowhere else, 2,417 of his 2,453 snaps in his career came all at right tackle. The only other 36 snaps, 33 came at right guard, 3 came at left tackle. So if you're talking about a true right guard that can come in here, potentially sit a year behind Morgan Moses and be a quality backup if Moses would to go down and develop similar to Olu, Emory Jones could potentially be that guy. Now, again, he's got a lot of work on. Some of the numbers aren't great. His PFF grade overall, 59.2. He did have a better PFF grade last year. This year took a little bit of a hit. His run blocking grade, 60.8. He is a better pass blocker than he is a run blocker. He's actually considered decently above average from a pass blocking perspective with a 67 pass block grade, which still isn't great. But again, that's why it's a day 2 guy that could sit, season a little bit behind Moses, and then potentially be a long-term option. You look at his career, 8 sacks given up, 6 quarterback hits, 73 hurries, 2024 stats. He let up a sack, 4 quarterback hits, 25 hurries. Most quarterback hits he's let up in a season. Just some things here. Strengths, his size, his length, his overall strength, no pun intended, is a strength of his. He's also got positive hand placement, and he's a good power blocker. Weaknesses, and I think this is where the developmental stuff comes in, needs work with footwork. Range isn't great. His base is not very strong. Typically, in bull rush and powerful defensive linemen, he can kind of get run over a little bit and get beat pretty badly. I think those are all things technique-wise that possibly sitting a year or learning could help benefit him moving forward. So that's Emory Jones. Round 3, pick 96. We're going to go Tez Johnson, wide receiver out of Oregon. Jets need wide receiver help. Whether or not Devontae Adams is back in 2025 should not dictate whether or not the Jets take a wide receiver in this draft. I think they've got to come away with a wide receiver in this draft, and then they've got to come away with potentially maybe a wide receiver we'll see in free agency, of course, the new regime. This receiving core needs a lot of help, especially if Devontae Adams isn't back. If Devontae Adams is not back, then it's Garrett Wilson. Allen Lazard's gone. So it's Garrett Wilson, Malachi Corley, Xavier Gipson. I mean, that is an awful, awful room outside of Garrett. So you need help at wide receiver. Even if Devontae's back, you gotta look forward to 2026 and beyond with this team and with this receiving core. So Tez Johnson will take a look at 5'10", 165, senior out of Oregon. Actually a pretty interesting story with Tez Johnson, a pretty cool story, actually. Had some hardships growing up. Bo Nix actually kind of took him under his wing in a way. And him and Bo Nix are very, very close. So does have that connection with Bo Nix just from his days at Oregon. But a really interesting story if you read up on him. 3 years at Troy, 2 years at Oregon, so 5 years in college football total. His career numbers, 310 receptions, 3,889 yards, 12.5 yards per reception, and 28 touchdowns. He took off at Oregon. No other way to put it. 169 receptions during his 2 years at Oregon, 2,080 yards, 12.3 yards per reception, and 20 touchdown. Had 1,000 yards last year, followed it up with a 2 yards short of a 900-yard season this year, 10 touchdowns in each of his past 2 seasons. Had career highs in 2023 in yards and receptions. So a guy that really took off these last 2 years. And I think what's positive when looking at some of these prospects is how have they looked recently? Have they gotten better? Right? Mason Graham's a guy that has consistently gotten better to where he's a top 10 pick. I think Tez Johnson's one of those guys that his 3 years at Troy kind of was a nobody. Had some tough beginnings, went to Oregon, kind of rejuvenated his entire career, his entire outlook on football, and had a very productive 2 years there. And is now has an opportunity here to go to the draft and potentially be, I think, a possible day 2 pick here, round 3, maybe early day 3 pick for this Jets team. Primarily plays the slot. 273 of his 391 snaps last season came from the slot. Finished with an 83.1 PFF grade. I think the Jets need some help in the slot. They do. They need a lot of help. I think Tez Johnson could potentially be a guy that, and again, we'll look over a lot of options. And by no means is these 8 players exactly who I want the Jets to take. No, it's only mock draft number 1. I fired it up this morning, went through the draft, and I'm giving you the names as I always do. For those of you that were here last year, you know the drill. We're going to take a look at a ton of prospects. Every draft, I'm going to try and draft different players so we can break down a ton of prospects and really figure out what fits best for this organization. Tez Johnson, more of a slot guy. You look at some of his strengths. He's good in space. He has the yards after catch threat, brings some special teams value, sort of labeled as a dual threat. You thought you were getting that last year in Malachi Corley. You didn't get it. The Jets have not gotten much slot production at all. They haven't gotten it at all, to the point where you see Garrett line up a lot in the slot. And I think if you bring Devontae back, I think it's very important for this new regime to figure out some answer in the slot. Something. And whether that's Malachi Corley or not, who knows? We'll find out what the new regime feels about him. But Tez Johnson could be one of those speed guys that can kind of open up the middle of the field underneath a little bit and keep the defense guessing instead of it just being a 2-man show outside. He is a guy, too, in trips formations, can line up outside and make some plays. But his size at 5'10", 165, that is one of his weaknesses. He is thin. It feels like when he gets to the next level, slot could be like his only option because he does struggle with drops at times, and he's not the best contested catch. But from the slot perspective, his speed and his size fits perfectly for that position. And his yards after a catch ability is under the radar. But it's certainly a positive of his. So Tez Johnson there, wide receiver out of Oregon. I think a name to look for as a potential day 2 pick to try and bring in a little extra talent or take some chances on some of these prospects because the receiving core desperately needs help. 4th pick of the draft here. We'll stay on offense. We'll stay in Oregon. Terrence Ferguson, tight end out of Oregon. round 4, pick 107 here. 6'5", 255 pounds, senior. It'll be interesting to see how the Jets look at the tight end position with the new regime, whether or not Tyler Conklin's back, whether or not whatever you do with Jeremy Ruckert, whether they move on from him potentially. Is he maybe a cut candidate moving into training camp and all that stuff? Those are all discussions that we'll have down the road here. We still got to figure out who this GM and head coach is going to be. But again, first mock draft just early on here. I think it would be smart at this moment in time here to draft a tight end. And I know a lot of people are high on Tyler Warren. He would be the top guy. He seems more like a first rounder, maybe early day 2. So if you go offensive lineman, if your priority is more defense, you're probably not going to get a Tyler Warren. How long do you want to wait on a tight end? How much do they value tight end? Those are all questions we'll find out. But in this case, day 3 tight end, in this world, you draft a Terrence Ferguson. Let's say you bring a Conklin back on a 1-year deal and you try and figure it out that way where you hope, okay, Conklin's been serviceable. You bring in a guy like a Terrence Ferguson who can develop and potentially be a long-term threat. 134 receptions in his career for 1,537 yards, 11.5 yards per reception, and 16 touchdowns. When you look at his 2024 numbers, he had a very big year. Career high in receptions with 43, career high in yards with 591, a career high in yards per reception with a 13.7. He also added on 3 touchdowns. I think something with Terrence Ferguson that translates, I think, well to the Jets is very good pass catcher and a very good red zone threat. Something that the Jets have not done well enough is capitalize in the red zone, and especially when it comes to the tight ends. And that's something I like a lot about Terrence Ferguson is his ability to make plays in the red zone. That can really benefit this offense going into 2025 if you get a red zone threat, a 6'5", big body tight end like Ferguson who can make some of those plays. Some of the weaknesses. Does lack speed at times. His yards after catch, not great. Not that that's much of a surprise for tight ends, but it kind of feels like the yak and the speed go hand in hand. More of a physical tight end that can go up and get it as opposed to a finesse tight end like a Brock Bowers or somebody like that last year that was sort of your wide receiver type tight end, not really your physical tight end. Terrence Ferguson is more of that physical red zone tight end that can go up, make the tough catches, make the tough plays, and do some damage that way. His blocking is interesting. I was watching some film on him earlier. He struggles against powerful edge rushers. So edge rushers that kind of bull rush, he struggles against. But against your average edge rusher, against those non-bull rushing power edge rushers, he has success from a run blocking perspective. So blocking does need some help, which, again, if he comes in and is kind of your 2 alongside a veteran for a year, that could potentially get better with time. So we'll go back to the defense here. After going 3 in a row on offense, we're going to go back to the defense. Round 5, pick 145, over to the SEC. Braden Swinson, edge rusher out of LSU, 6'4", 250, senior. Some background information here. Spent 3 seasons at Oregon and then 2 seasons at LSU. So 5 years total in college football. And I'll be honest, I really personally like this pick in the 5th round. I think there is a lot of things when you look at Braden Swinson as a prospect that potentially pop off the chart as maybe a day 3 steal for this team. His career stats, 127 total tackles, 65 solo tackles, 13.5 sacks, 26 tackles for loss, 10 passes defended, and 5 forced fumbles. Had a big year in 2024. 59 tackles, 31 solo tackles, both were career highs for him. He also had 8.5 sacks, which was a career high. Not only that, though, those 8.5 sacks led LSU and were 7th in the SEC. He also added on 2 forced fumbles and 3 passes defended. This was a guy that had a very, very big 2024 campaign. And he has a knack for just getting home to the quarterback. I kind of compare Braden Swinson in a way, is a little bit like a Will McDonald. Some of his strengths: athleticism, quick off the ball, good awareness. He feels like a little bit of a Will McDonald, especially when you look at his build, 6'4", 250. One of his weaknesses is he is a light frame. But this is a guy that feels like, okay, day 3, he has shown a lot of good things. If you can bring him in and develop, and he potentially turns into that pass rusher that we saw Will McDonald turn into, that could be scary down the road. And that's what I like about him. He does need some work against the run, but his awareness, he does have some versatility. He has shown the ability to play inside and outside, which I think is a positive for the Jets. I do believe, though, Braden Swinson, you look at the size, he's going to need to get a little bit bigger if he's going to want to play the inside as well in the NFL. But I think just his pure ability to get home to the quarterback and his athleticism, his speed off the edge is really impressive for potential day 3 prospect. I think this could potentially be a guy that can come in, develop, and be a rotational piece maybe for alongside Jermaine Johnson and Will McDonald and guys like that, assuming he can beef up a little bit, improve against the run, and all those things. So round 5, pick 145, Braden Swinson. Some more defensive line help. Round 5, 157. We're going to take a look at a quarterback here. I'll be honest, this is not my top pick for quarterback. This is far from it. It just so happened how I kind of drafted. I waited a little bit longer on quarterback. Next draft will probably go a little bit earlier. Riley Leonard, quarterback out of Notre Dame, 6'4", 216 senior. 3 seasons at Duke. This year, of course, at Notre Dame. Now has a chance to play for a national title next Monday. I'll be honest, I don't love Riley Leonard. I think you could look at a lot of better options. But again, I'm going to take a look at a wide range of players. This just so happened how the board shook out. You look at Leonard as a prospect, his career numbers, he's completed 63.5% of his passes for 7,056 yards, 7.1 yards per completion, 43 touchdowns, 18 picks, and a 134.1 rating. When you look at this season's numbers, he's completed 66.4% of his passes for 2,606 yards, 19 touchdowns, 8 picks, and a PFF grade of 82.3, and a passer rating of 137.8, which is the second highest he's ever had in a season, only behind his 2022 campaign with Duke, where he threw for 20 touchdowns. Again, I think this is probably where you're going to find Riley Leonard, 5th round, 6th round. I would personally take a look at a Kyle McCord earlier, or maybe even a Jackson Dart, who seems like he's rising up a lot of draft boards. He feels like he could be this year's NFL quarterback draft darling. But overall, I mean, if we're being honest, this quarterback class just isn't great. It's just not a great class. And I think you're going to take a pretty large risk no matter who you pick. I even think Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders going in the top 3 is going to be a pretty large risk. I think there's a lot of things you can be concerned about in Shedeur's game, and I think there's some things that you can be concerned about in Cam Ward's game, and that's with every player. But I don't really think there's a very complete quarterback prospect. There isn't. Last year, there was a couple. And come to find out, last year's quarterback class was pretty dang good when you look at it, now looking back on it, right? So Riley Leonard, we'll look at here. One thing Riley Leonard is good at, very, very quick completion guy. His adjusted completion percentage, I believe, was like 74.6, which was like 15th in college football. So it's top 15 in the country from a completion standpoint. But you take a look, you want a deep threat, you want a big play guy. Riley Leonard's not exactly that, but he's a high completion, smart quarterback that makes the right decisions, can manage a game. His QBR this year, 77.7, was 15th. He's not going to make many big mistakes, but he's not going to make many big plays. And I think when you get to the 5th round, sometimes you're better off going after a guy that's maybe a little bit more mistake ridden, but is more of a high risk, high reward, where if you get those mistakes out of them, you could potentially be like Riley Leonard. To me, is a very high floor guy, very low ceiling. I think his ceiling's very low. But we'll take him here at round 5. Round number 6, pick 182, second to last pick. We're going to go back to defense. Jets need some help at safety. We're going to go Malik Vernon, safety out of Iowa State, 6'4", 220. You look at this Jets safety room, Chuck Clark, free agent, Tony Adams, free agent. Or not Tony Adams, apologize. Ashton Davis, free agent. Tony Adams, too, free agent. So you've got a lot of free agents. You've got pretty much your top 3 guys, free agents. So, you look at that room, or Tony Adams, I believe. No, never mind. Tony Adams has got 1 more year left. I apologize. It's Ashton Davis. It's Chuck Clark, both free agents. Tony Adams, right? Woody Johnson, I guess mid-year told him to bench him. The Jets need help at safety. To me, I think it's better off of selling a little bit higher at that position. The Jets under this past regime never sold very high on it. I think you got to go out there and spend some money on the position. No more of this 1-year rental stuff where you're picking up guys at the end of your prime or stuff like that. I think you've got to go out and pick up a proven guy, but I also don't think it could hurt through the draft, drafting a guy either. So go with Malik Vernon here. By no means am I saying this guy's got to be your starting safety, but I think to potentially bring in his depth. I mean, the Jets tried to do it last year with Jalen Key. It didn't quite work. Could it potentially be different here if they take a safety? Maybe they take a safety earlier. We'll see, but this is what we go with here. Career stats, 133 total tackles, 67 solo tackles, 10 passes defended, a sack, a forced fumble, 3 picks, and 7 tackles for loss. His 2024 season saw him put up career highs in both tackles and total tackles and solo tackles. Passes defended, sacks, forced fumbles, and tackles for loss. So big year there. A rookie to come in, compete in what is a very needy safety room that needs a lot of help. So Malik Vernon to come in and see if he can play a role here at all on a 6th round dart throw. Final pick here in our first mock draft, round 6, pick 207, Patrick Jenkins, defensive tackle, Tulane. So we'll finish out here with 2 defensive players, 6'2", 293 senior. Background information, 2 seasons at TCU, 3 seasons at Tulane, 5 years total in college football. So he's ready to see where he lands here in the draft. 132 total tackles, 68 solo tackles, 14 sacks, forced fumble, 2 passes defended, and 28 tackles for loss in his career. This season put up 33 total tackles, 15 of them were solo, 4.5 sacks, 2 passes defended, and 7 tackles for loss. A late round dart throw, you get to pick 207. Don't expect much here, but some defensive line help. A heavy dose of defense in this draft. The Jets need help there. They also pick up some playmakers on offense. That's draft number 1. So once again, let's run through it. Throw up the graphic here on the screen. Round 1, pick 7, Mason Graham, defensive tackle. Round 2, pick 38, Emory Jones, right tackle, offensive tackle. Tez Johnson, round 3, pick 96, Tez Johnson, wide receiver. Round 4, pick 107, Terrence Ferguson, tight end. Round 5, pick 145, Braden Swinson, edge. Round 5, 157, Riley Leonard, quarterback. Round 6, pick 182, Malik Vernon, safety. And closing it out, round 6, 207, Patrick Jenkins, defensive tackle out of Tulane. So there's your first mock draft Monday in the books. We'll be back next week with another edition of the Mock Draft Monday episode. Let me know what you think in the comments section down below. Like it, don't like it. What's your latest mock draft? Where do you stand with the Jets heading into the 2025 NFL draft? Of course, a lot of questions with the way this regime views this roster, but figured we get started this week anyway and continue it here up until April. So stay tuned. A lot more content coming your way. Until next time, JETS, 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 Jets.